for all practical purposes, do you think a woman in the United States today actually be nominated on the ticket as president?
Because how dare you? Have you forgotten that you are a woman?
If I had to say that all of America was ready, no, it's not quite there yet.
Well, this isn't exactly the party I planned, but I sure like the company. I know we have still not shattered that highest and hardest glass ceiling, but someday someone will, and hopefully sooner than we might think right now.
There are those who make the contention that no woman should ever dare to aspire to the White House, that this is a man's world, and that it should be kept that way.
Margaret Chase Smith was the first Republican woman to run for president. She was a 3-term senator from Maine. The day she announced, Washington Post columnists had already dubbed her campaign non-serious.
The idea of a woman running for president of the United States wasn't taken seriously.
Smith had spent the previous 24 years in Congress, initially elected to her husband's seat when he died. But around the country, opportunities for women to enter male-dominated jobs were shrinking after World War II.
Rosie the Riveter had to go back home and start making dinner again. Women gained traction, if you will, as workers, but then the men came back and there was an understanding that they had to be employed.
There was no organized women's movement there to fight for them. And this is why the 1950s women's rights went into a deep crater.
Don't you think marriage is just the most important thing in the world? I mean, a woman isn't really a woman at all until she's been married and had children.
This was an era when the National Weather Service started giving hurricanes female names, and when airline stewardesses were fired when they turned 32. For 2 decades, there was little change in the percentage of Americans who said that they would vote for a female presidential candidate if she was qualified. That stagnation coincided with a broad effort to reassert traditional gender roles as part of the ideological battles of the Cold War.
You know, they say a woman's place is in the home, and I suppose as long as she's in the home, she might as well be in the kitchen.
It had become popular for Freudian psychologists to blame working women for society's ills.
Everywhere, children of working parents are being left without adequate supervision or restraint.
Catastrophic social forces have propelled American women away from femininity and into careers at terrific cost to themselves and society.
Political operatives were able to leverage these trends to end the career of Minnesota Congresswoman Koya Knutson in 1958. She lost her re-election after they arranged for her estranged husband to publish a letter asking for her to come home and care for their family. And those women who somehow managed to get a law degree at that time faced open discrimination when they graduated.
I called at least 40 of those firms asking for an interview, and not one of them would give me an interview. I was a woman, and they said, we don't hire women.
When the women's liberation movement got up and running in the late 60s and in the 70s, the early priorities were fighting job discrimination and securing equal rights in the law. During this time, the number of women in Congress barely changed, but the Democratic Party saw a female presidential candidate in Shirley Chisholm, a congresswoman from New York.
I stand before you today as a candidate for the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States of America.
She was a truly feminist, anti-racist lawmaker.
I believe we are intelligent enough to recognize the talent, energy, and dedication which all Americans, including women and minorities, have to offer.
Chisholm was one of the prominent feminists who created the National Women's Political Caucus in 1971 with the goal of electing more women to Congress. In response, the Secretary of State at the time reportedly joked with President Nixon that the women resembled a burlesque. By 1977, fully half of the country still agreed with the statement that most men are better suited emotionally for politics than most women.
You both have combined, it seems to me, very successfully marriage and politics. What do you say to people that say the two might be incompatible? How have you done this?
Well, I think that's probably the most offensive question that's ever asked, because I truly believe that men and women are equal. And I've never heard anyone ask a man, how has it been on your family? I mean, it's seldom asked.
We had made very little progress from the dawn of the women's movement. In fact, Democratic women had lost seats in the House.
Nevertheless, in 1984, women's groups convinced the Democratic presidential candidate to choose a congresswoman as his running mate.
I looked for the best vice president, and I found her in Jerry Ferraro.
Oh, I thought our lives would change.
If we can do this, we can do anything.
Women were coming out in record numbers, and they would bring their children and hold their babies up, like show their daughters what it would be like to have a woman running for vice president.
And everything will be different after this. It wasn't.
Geraldine Ferraro, the Democrat who wants to be vice president. Ms. Ferraro, could you push the nuclear button?
Let me help you with the difference, Ms. Ferraro, between Iran and the embassy in Lebanon.
Let me just say, first of all, that I almost resent Vice President Bush, your patronizing attitude that you have to teach me about foreign policy.
The majority of women, like the majority of men, voted for the popular incumbent president that year. It would be more than 2 decades before one of the major parties nominated another woman for vice president. In the 1980s, women caught up to men in college enrollment, and they'd surpassed them in voter turnout rates in presidential elections. But the public and the press still didn't know what to make of women seeking elected office, as Congresswoman Patricia Schroeder found when she briefly considered running for president in the 1988 election.
The first thing you always get is, well, you don't look presidential. I mean, my answer was always, I know that. There's never been a president of the United States that looks like me. I find that regrettable, but,
When she announced that she was ending or suspending her campaign, it was clear that she was not going to win in the primaries. She became emotional just for a moment.
I could not figure out how to run and not be separated from those I serve. There must be a way, but I haven't figured it out yet.
She was roundly pilloried. Oh, this proves it. Women are too soft. Women are too emotional. And the impact on Congresswoman Schroeder was not very great. I've met her. She's an amazingly tough, optimistic, extraordinary person. The impact was on bystander women who might have been thinking that they might want to run.
Women running for office faced a double bind. They had to appear tough enough to lead, but if they were too tough or too confident, they violated norms about how women were supposed to behave. This is how the Washington Post described Barbara Mikulski after she became one of 2 women in the Senate in 1986.
There was one Republican woman, Nancy Kassebaum, and Senator Mikulski, and 98 men.
Malcolm's new fundraising organization, Emily's List, had helped make Mikulski a credible candidate. Together, they set out to bring more Democratic women to Congress, and they got a boost when law professor Anita Hill was called to testify about a Supreme Court nominee.
Clarence Thomas called Anita Hill a liar. Hill said Thomas sexually harassed her, and she passed a lie detector test.
The all-male panel doing the hearings for Clarence Thomas decided to simply attack her.
Are you a scorned woman? I would think that these things, what you describe, are so repugnant that you would never have talked to him again. And that is a most contradictory and puzzling thing for me.
What Anita Hill was describing was absolutely resonant with what so many women had experienced in their own lifetime. They knew she was telling the truth.
Women were furious, and when they found out there were only 2 women in the Senate, they decided they were going to do something about it, and they did.
They're calling it the Year of the Woman. What impact will it have on Congress?
And what we see today is simply a dress rehearsal for the day and time we meet in convention to nominate Madam President.
The 1992 election brought in 24 congresswomen and 4 female senators.
Some women spend their life looking out the window for Prince Charming. I've been waiting 6 years for new women to come to the United States Senate.
And I was telling the students at the time that 8 women had been elected to the United States Senate. And one little girl looked at me and said, "Is that all?" Her universe, her world, showed her the possibilities. And that is the progress that we have achieved.
While women continued to make slow but steady gains in Congress, lack of money and party support prevented female candidates from making credible bids at a presidential nomination.
I think what we've done is pave the way for the person who will be the first woman president.
We are committed to opening up our democracy. We will get there one day.
So when Hillary Clinton entered the 2008 primaries as the presumptive frontrunner for the Democratic nomination, it was utterly unprecedented.
If it's not you, how disappointed will you be?
Well, it will be me. Like congressional candidates in the 80s and 90s, Clinton's strategy was to campaign as any man would, emphasizing strength and minimizing gender.
Her advisors were absolutely determined to downplay that.
If we have the will, she has the strength. If we have the conviction, she has the experience.
I think it started changing at the end of the primaries in 2008.
But I am a woman, and like millions of women, I know there are still barriers and biases out there, often unconscious.
Her attempt to run a genderless campaign didn't keep sexism out of the election.
I don't know, but that is so perfect. As I have often said, when she comes on television, I involuntarily cross my legs.
She morphed into a scolding mother, looking like everyone's first wife standing outside a probate court.
By the time of her concession speech, Clinton seemed to recognize that her supporters didn't want to ignore gender.
I had managed somehow to get on some kind of a platform so I could actually see her from very far away. And what was really striking to me is I'm looking around and many, many, many women in tears.
Although we weren't able to shatter that highest, hardest glass ceiling this time, thanks to you, it's got about 18 million cracks in it. And the light is shining through like never before, filling us all with the hope and the sure knowledge that the path will be a little easier next time.
8 years later, Clinton openly campaigned on her experiences as a woman.
Oh, look, I'm not asking people to vote for me because I'm a woman, but I think if you vote for somebody on the merits, one of my merits is I'm a woman, and I think that makes a big difference in today's world.
Oddly, the first woman to come close to the presidency faced an openly sexist opponent.
You know, you could see there was blood coming out of her eyes, blood coming out of her wherever.
Look at that face, he cries. Would anybody vote for that? Can you imagine that? The face of our next president. I mean, she's a woman. I'm not supposed to say bad things, but really, folks, come on. Are we serious?
Earlier this month, you said she doesn't have, quote, a presidential look. She's standing here right now. What did you mean by that?
She doesn't have the look. She doesn't have the stamina.
But women have never voted as a unified bloc.
The exit poll, sir, shows that Trump did better with women than expected. For example, white women ages 45 to 64. Trump won by 19 points there.
So how much longer will it be? Well, that depends on how many women are in the pipeline.
We just don't have that many women in the Senate or in governor's mansions, and those are the two most likely paths to the presidency.
The focus on the presidential race can obscure the fact that women who run for Congress and for governor are just as likely as men to win. The problem is that fewer women are running.
We identified a national sample of lawyers, business leaders, educators, and political activists. And across the board, there was about a 16 percentage point gender gap in political ambition.
They've done this survey twice, and the gap didn't shrink between 2001 and 2011. When asked if they were qualified for public office, the women rated themselves lower than men.
We second guess ourselves. We always try and say, well, what if this happens? Or what if I'm not ready? Or what if I don't know enough? And that's where women hold themselves back.
The confidence gap between men and women is a broad societal problem, but there's one easy way to continue working toward gender parity in politics.
Women are less likely than men to be recruited or encouraged to run for office. And when women and men get that encouragement, get that boost, they're far more likely to throw their hats into the ring.
There's a lot of ways we can find support for you, but we need your leadership and your intelligence and your hard work to make this democracy work.
All the rights that we have are tenuous. It depends on administration, it depends on current politicians, it depends on memory. So be vigilant, be the voice for change. Don't just be a recipient of it.
You will have successes and setbacks too. This loss hurts, but please never stop believing that fighting for what's right is worth it.
Thank you.